Once upon a time, there was a little lady named Susanna Cotton. And Susanna grew up, as you can see, in a mansion most grandly furnished. But in addition to the grand furnishings, there also happened to be a few grand old ghosts. First, there was the ghost that lived in the pianoforte, and this was the ghost of Papa's great-aunt Myrtle, who had never deigned to touch the pianoforte herself, but had once declared that Papa's fingers were far too fat and chubby and slow to be tackling something so delicate as Brahms. The ghost of Great-Aunt Myrtle often hid in death as she had in life, but if anyone should ever try to touch those keys, she would pop out and scream and wail about the fat fingers, whether or not the person was actually Papa. And then there was the ghost that lurked above her mother's bureau. And this ghost didn't hide. No, this ghost hung out in plain sight, staring at everyone in all directions. It was the ghost of her mother's mother, a most unhappy woman, who said very little, but looked very much, and in looking made you feel very, very small indeed. Now, Susanna Cotton, having grown up with all of these ghosts, had determined absolutely that she would not live such a life when she grew up. She was going to be much more sensible. She was not going to waste her money on grand furnishings, which could be grandly haunted. She was going to live simply, and live simply she did. When Susanna Cotton grew up, she found a wonderful hill with a little house on the top. And she lived there with her simple table and her simple chair and her simple stove at which she could cook. And she even splurged on a simple bookcase for holding her 3 books and her mending. And Susanna, I am happy to tell you, was most proud of herself for creating a life so completely different from the one she had grown up with. She had planned to mend things, she planned to garden, and most of all, she planned to bake her own bread. And that is precisely what she did. The first morning after moving into her new house, Susanna lit a fire in her stove, tied on her apron, and began to cook, and the smell wafted through her simple house and into her simple nose and delighted her simple soul. But can you imagine the horror that transpired when she opened her simple oven and pulled out 2 simple loaves, but not just loaves, attached to them a ghost? She didn't quite recognize this ghost. She had a vague feeling maybe she had seen it before, but there it was, nevertheless, eating her bread. Now, you say a ghost can't eat, and you would be right to say so. But what a ghost can do is it can get down so deep into your food that it sucks out all the flavor, so that all you are left with is a dry crumb that is tasteless. Now, Susanna, being a very industrious sort of girl, thought that she would just work harder. She would bake more bread, which would have more flavor, and sure enough, she did that, and out popped another ghost, who ate all of the flavor. Later that day, she tried donuts. Once again, a ghost came to suck out all of the flavor. And this ghost, she felt, maybe she did know. She had an inkling, but she couldn't remember where. It didn't matter what she made, whether it was home-cooked or frozen crinkle fries. Every time she pulled it out of the oven, there was a ghost to eat it up and take out all the joy of her life. Well, Susanna Cotton was very stern about this. She was not about to let some ghosts, she didn't even know who they were, ruin her life. So she concocted a brilliant plan. She built a cage. a giant cage. A great, magnificent, giant cage. And then she baked apple turnovers and more donuts. She baked carrot cake. And then she placed all of these delicious foods underneath her cage. And sure enough, the ghosts came to them in hordes. And they were trapped. Mountains and mountains of ghosts. Susanna Cotton was very pleased with herself, you might imagine. But then, imagine her horror when 3 little ghosts grew legs and walked right out of her cage. Whatever was she to do about this? So Susanna decided, well, I moved out of my old house because it was haunted. I can move out of this one too and make a new life for myself. And so she set off. She set off on an epic journey across all the world looking for a new house. She went through valleys and over mountains. She trudged and trudged and trudged. But every time she looked behind her, there were 3 leering faces following. She was about at her wit's end. She didn't know what to do. And one day, as they were trudging along, she saw a black bear. And she thought, that black bear looks as black as I feel. Maybe I should follow it. But she didn't. And then along came a black rat. And she thought, that black rat looks as angry as I feel. Maybe I should follow it. But she did not. Then along came a black elephant, black as night and loud as thunder, and she thought, that elephant looks as saggy as my heart. Maybe I should follow it. But she did not. She stood there a good long while, and all of a sudden a mighty wind came, a rushing wind that nearly knocked her off her feet. And it was a giant black bat that obliterated the sun and blocked out all light. And she thought, yes, this is what it feels like to be haunted. And she followed. She doesn't know why she followed, or for how long she followed. She only knew that she had to follow these black creatures. And right along behind her, sure enough, came her 3 persistent ghosts. Till one day, the black creatures stopped walking. The black creatures came to a circus. And they disappeared. They were gone. The moment they set foot in that circus, the black creatures went away. But the black feeling stayed in Susanna's heart. She wandered from booth to booth, from clown to clown, trying to figure out where the black creatures had gone, and why it was she could no longer see them. She began to ask of the clowns, where are the black creatures who look like my heart? And the clowns had no answer. The clowns had not seen any black creatures. They had only seen a little girl named Susanna Cotton, and they had seen 3 ghosts. Now, Susanna was most annoyed by this development, because up until now, the ghosts had not been visible by anybody except herself. Nobody could see another person's ghosts, except for these clowns. And when they mentioned the fact that she had some rather persistent friends hanging about, she threw a fit. She threw a temper tantrum fit to flood the Mississippi. The clowns just smiled and said, I think you best be getting home and taking care of this. And she said, no, no, you don't understand. I went on this long journey. I went all this way to figure out how to get rid of them. I can't go home. And the clown said, ah, but you must. because they will never leave you alone anywhere else. So Susanna began the sad job of journeying home, all the way back across those miles, with her 3 doleful companions always behind her, until they came back to their own little piece of the wood, back to their own little house on the hill. And she sat down in her very favorite chair and said, "Now then, what seems to be the matter? You've eaten my bread, you've eaten my sweets, you've blackened my heart, you followed me all the way across the world. Why won't you leave me alone?" And the 3 little ghosts began to weep. And Susanna said, "What is wrong?" And the first little ghost said, "Nobody's ever asked us how we are. They're always asking how they are themselves." And Susanna said, "Well, tell me your stories, one and all." And she baked them some bread, which she had no intention of eating herself, but simply let them take the flavor out of it as nourishment for their little souls. Now some of the ghosts, their stories were simple. A scraped knee that no one kissed, an angry look from a cat, real or imagined, a schoolyard slur. And those ghosts, once they told their stories, and Susanna appropriately kissed their knees and patted their heads and told them that, "My dear, cats don't always look kindly upon you," those ghosts went away and vanished. But there were some ghosts, like this one, who didn't go away. Their stories were more complex and deeper and harder and darker and black as the night. And much as Susanna Cotton would have loved to be rid of this little ghost with his sad little moony tail, she couldn't. And so she made a habit of inviting him to tea and giving him a place at her table. And she found something amazing. Once he had a place at her simple table, and with his own little cup and his own little bowl and his own little special donut. Once he had a place at her table, he rarely wanted to leave it. He knew where his place was, and he stayed there quite contentedly, and Susanna jokingly called him Little Moony. And yes, sometimes Little Moony would get a little bit too big for his britches and cause all kinds of havoc in her life. But for the most part, Susanna Cotton and Little Moony got on swimmingly for the rest of their days, living simply in a little house on the hill.